Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
It usually doesn't happen during the relationship. That's the strange part. People think the moment that changes him is the intimacy itself, the confession, the connection, the late-night conversations where he almost says what he really feels. But honestly, a lot of men survive those moments by emotionally leaving while they're still physically present. He'll hold her hand while mentally preparing his exit. He'll say, "I just need space," while checking his phone every 7 minutes hoping she texted first. He'll sleep next to someone he deeply cares about and still feel cornered by it. Not because he doesn't feel anything. Sometimes because he feels too much. And that's the part nobody talks about honestly enough. What finally breaks him open usually happens later. In ordinary moments. Embarrassingly small moments. A silence that lasts too long. Her absence becoming routine. Hearing a joke she would have laughed at. Driving home after pretending he had a good night. Opening her profile without liking anything. Realizing he's become emotionally homesick for someone he convinced himself he needed distance from. And the worst part is, by the time he finally understands what he was feeling, he's usually already hurt her with the confusion of it. Not always intentionally, but damage doesn't disappear just because someone was scared. Part of him knew that. Part of him still ran anyway. And if I'm being honest, sometimes the thing that finally cracks him open isn't losing her. It's realizing he became someone he doesn't fully recognize while trying not to need her. That realization hits differently at 2:13 in the morning. Usually in silence. Usually alone. Usually after months of pretending he's fine. And now, it doesn't suddenly turn him into a wise man. Sometimes he still avoids. Sometimes he still says nothing. Sometimes he types the message and deletes it 3 times. But internally, something starts collapsing. Not loudly. Not spiritually. Not beautifully. Just humanly. Like finally getting tired of lying to yourself. At first, the distance felt like relief. That's the part people don't say out loud because it sounds cruel. But when he pulled away, when he finally got back into his own apartment, his own car, his own routines, his body relaxed before his conscience caught up. No emotional conversations waiting for him. No feeling observed all the time. No pressure to explain why he went quiet halfway through dinner. No one asking, "Are you okay?" in that tone that somehow felt to caring and to exposing at the same time. Just silence. And honestly, part of him liked the silence. Not because he didn't love her. Not even because he wanted to leave. He was just tired of feeling emotionally cornered by how real everything had become. That's the contradiction people misunderstand about men like this. The closer the connection gets, the more emotionally split he becomes. One part of him wants to stay inside it forever. Another part starts looking for exits before or anything even goes wrong. And the strange thing is sometimes he doesn't even consciously realize he's doing it. It starts small, replying a little slower, needing more time alone, saying work's been crazy when work actually ended 3 hours ago, and he's just been sitting in the car scrolling mindlessly through videos he's not even paying attention to. Then, eventually, the sentence appears, "I just need some space." And maybe part of him even believes it when he says it. Because emotionally overwhelmed men often confuse distance with regulation. They think if they can just get far enough away from the feeling, their nervous system will finally settle down. But that's not what happens. Not really. At first, yes. There's relief. He sleeps slightly better for 2 nights. The pressure in his chest softens. His phone stops making his stomach tighten. But then other things start happening. Quiet things. Embarrassing things. He reaches for his phone automatically while walking through the grocery store before remembering there's probably no message from her anymore. He sees something funny online and instinctively thinks, she would have understood this immediately. Then he catches himself, locks the phone, keeps walking, like pretending not to think about her somehow counts as emotional progress. It's strange how masculine avoidance works sometimes. It doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes, it just looks like a man reorganizing his kitchen cabinets at 11:40 p.m. because he can't emotionally settle down enough to sleep. Sometimes, it looks like him watching an entire season of a show he barely absorbs because silence feels dangerous now. Sometimes, it looks like him telling his friends, honestly, I think I just needed room to breathe, while secretly checking if she viewed his story. And the worst part of him genuinely believes he's doing the right thing. That's what makes this so messy. Because he's not sitting there twirling his mustache trying to manipulate somebody. He's overwhelmed, emotionally inexperienced, terrified by how attached he became, ashamed of how much he needs someone, and trying to regain emotional control the only way he knows how: distance. But distance has side effects nobody prepares him for. Because now there's no distraction from himself. No conversations covering up the emotional static underneath him. No physical intimacy temporarily soothing the panic. No routines built around another person. Just him. And unfortunately, a lot of men discover very quickly they don't actually know how to sit with themselves peacefully, especially after deep emotional intimacy. So he becomes busy, artificially busy. He suddenly starts going to the gym more, cleaning more, working longer, answering texts faster from people he normally ignores. His energy gets weird, restless, like his body knows something emotionally important is happening, but his mind is still trying to frame it as independence. And then the contradictions begin. He misses her, while also feeling relieved she's not there. He wants to text her, while resenting the emotional vulnerability required to do it. He thinks about her constantly, while insisting to himself he made the right decision. None of it feels stable internally. That's the truth. Avoidance doesn't create peace. It creates emotional fragmentation. But from the outside, he can still look calm. That's the dangerous part. Men are often rewarded socially for emotional detachment. Nobody really questions him when he says, I just need to focus on myself right now. People nod, respect it, call it maturity. Meanwhile, he's driving around at midnight replaying one specific moment over and over again. Not even a dramatic moment. Just her sitting on the edge of the bed one night asking softly, why do you disappear emotionally when things get good? And he remembers how fast he looked away after she said it. How irritated he suddenly became. How he said, I don't know what you want me to say. But what he really meant was, I don't like that you noticed. That's the thing that starts haunting him after distance. Not just her absence, her accuracy. The terrifying feeling of being emotionally seen by someone while still not fully understanding yourself. And honestly, that kind of intimacy can feel invasive to someone who spent years surviving through emotional compartmentalization. So he withdraws. Not always because he stopped caring. Sometimes because caring started dismantling emotional structures he's depended on his whole life. Structures like, don't need too much. Don't feel too much. Stay in control. Don't let someone affect you this deeply. Then suddenly someone does. And his entire internal system starts malfunctioning. So now, he's alone in his apartment pretending to enjoy the freedom he asked for. The room feels oddly loud. There's a hoodie of hers over the chair he still hasn't moved. A glass in the sink from 2 days ago. Laundry sitting untouched because his motivation keeps disappearing halfway through tasks. He opens her conversation thread, scrolls upward, stops at old messages, little normal things. Drive safe. Did you eat? That made me think of you. The intimacy of ordinary care hits differently after separation, especially for emotionally avoidant men, because grand romantic moments are easier to intellectualize. But ordinary tenderness, that gets into the nervous system, and suddenly he remembers tiny things at random times. The way she touched his arm absent-mindedly while talking. How she looked at him when he got quiet instead of forcing conversation. The specific pause before she said, "You don't have to handle everything alone." That sentence especially. For some reason that one keeps following him round. Maybe because part of him wanted to believe it, and another part immediately distrusted it. That's the exhausting reality nobody talks about enough. Some men are starving for intimacy while simultaneously resisting it with everything in them. Not because they enjoy hurting people. Not because they're emotionless. Because vulnerability wakes up old survival instincts they don't even fully understand. So, after closeness comes withdrawal. After intimacy comes emotional static. After tenderness comes the urge to escape. Even when escaping hurts too. Especially when escaping hurts too. And eventually the silence starts changing shape. At first it felt powerful, controlled. Now it feels heavier. Now he starts wondering things he didn't expect. Is she okay? Is she angry? Is she moving on? Would she even respond if I texted her? Then comes the ego. Then shame. Then avoidance again. So, instead of reaching out, he opens her profile silently at 1:17 a.m. and stares at the screen like that somehow counts as connection. It's pathetic. Human. Painfully common. And deep down he knows it. There's usually a moment where reality starts slipping through the cracks of his emotional strategy. A small moment. Maybe he hears a song she used to play in the car, and his chest tightens before he can stop it. Maybe he laughs at something during the day, then immediately thinks, "I should send this to." And the realization hits halfway through the thought. Or maybe it happens while lying in bed after another long distracted day where he suddenly notices something terrifying. The distance isn't calming him down anymore. It's just making him lonely. That realization usually arrives quietly. No dramatic music. No spiritual awakening. No cinematic breakthrough. Just a man staring at the ceiling realizing the silence he fought for is beginning to eat him alive. And the worst part of him still wants to run from the feeling instead of face it. Because now he has to painful truths sitting in the room together. He needed space. And losing the connection hurts more than he expected. Both are true. That's what makes this kind of emotional unraveling so confusing. Nothing feels clean. Nothing feels noble. Just contradictory. Human. Unresolved. And somewhere inside himself, even if he can't fully admit it yet, he's beginning to realize the distance didn't remove the attachment. It only removed the distraction from it. The strange thing about emotional separation is that the body usually figures it out first, long before the ego does, long before the explanations, long before the "I'm fine." The body knows. And honestly, that realization embarrassed him more than the heartbreak itself, because mentally, he was still trying to maintain the story. He needed space. Things got too intense. He had to focus on himself. The connection became overwhelming. All the usual phrases men use when they're trying to create emotional order out of internal chaos. And maybe some of it was even true. But meanwhile, his nervous system was acting like someone had quietly removed oxygen from the room. He just didn't understand it yet. At first, the symptoms barely registered. He became restless at night. Not dramatically. Not movie scene depressed. Just unsettled. Like his body could never fully land anywhere. He'd sit down to watch something and immediately pick up his phone. Open an app. Close it. Walk into the kitchen. Forget why he went in there. Open the refrigerator. Stare into it without seeing anything. Then suddenly think about her for half a second. Not even emotionally. Just mechanically. She used to buy that drink. Then immediately shut the thought down. Like his own mind was trying to protect him from itself. But the body keeps score in humiliating little ways. That's what nobody prepares you for. He started waking up earlier than usual. Sometimes round 4:30 in the morning. Not panicked. Not crying. Just awake. Staring at the ceiling with this strange heaviness in his chest that didn't fully make sense. And the annoying part was during the daytime, he could still function normally. He could laugh with co-workers, go to the gym, answer emails, make plans, which only confused him more. Because if he was really hurting that badly, shouldn't he be falling apart all the time? But emotional suppression doesn't usually look dramatic externally. A lot of the time it looks incredibly functional. That's why so many people miss it. The body doesn't always collapse loudly. Sometimes it just stays in low-grade survival mode for months. And eventually tiny things start triggering reactions he can't fully control. He hears someone laugh in public, and for one split second his stomach tightens because it sounds like her. Not exactly her, just close enough. His body reacts before his brain catches up. Then comes the realization, then irritation, then denial. Jesus Christ, why am I still thinking about this? So he moves faster, distracts harder, keeps himself stimulated. Music, podcasts, background noise, scrolling, anything to avoid stillness. Because stillness has started becoming dangerous now. Stillness allows memory to enter the room, and memory has become physical. That's the part people misunderstand about emotional attachment. It isn't just thoughts. It lives in muscle memory, routines, reflexes. His hand still reaches toward the passenger seat sometimes when he brakes suddenly. Like some part of his body still assumes she's there. And those moments, those are the ones that really get him. Because they bypass pride completely. There's no intellectual defense against reflex. One night he's driving home late after being out with friends. The evening was objectively fine. People were laughing. Someone bought shots. Everybody kept telling him he seemed better. And maybe for a few hours he believed them. Then he gets into the car alone, and silence enters immediately. No music at first, just the engine humming quietly. He stops at a red light and catches himself reaching for his phone automatically. Not consciously, just instinctively wanting to tell her something funny that happened. Then halfway through unlocking the screen, the realization hits. There's nobody to send it to anymore. Or maybe there is, but not like before. And suddenly the entire emotional atmosphere changes. He leans back in the seat, exhales hard, turns the music on too loudly, as if volume can interrupt grief. That's the thing about masculine avoidance. It often survives through interruption. Don't feel it fully. Move away from it quickly. Replace the emotion before it settles into the body. So now, he's driving through empty streets at midnight pretending the music is the reason his chest feels tight. Pretending exhaustion is just exhaustion. Not loss. Definitely not loss. Because loss would mean the connection mattered more than he wanted it to. And that realization threatens his entire emotional identity. So instead, he intellectualizes. Maybe we were incompatible. Maybe it was too emotionally intense. Maybe I just got attached to the attention. Maybe I'm romanticizing things now because she's gone. And honestly, some of those thoughts might even contain partial truth. That's what makes this kind of emotional unraveling so confusing. Human feelings are rarely clean, but his body doesn't care about philosophical accuracy. His body only knows. Someone emotionally important disappeared, and now his nervous system keeps searching for them in ordinary places. He starts noticing how emotionally irritable he's becoming. Little things suddenly exhaust him. People talking too much. Crowded rooms. Text conversations that feel shallow. Even attraction feels different now. He tries talking to other women sometimes. Not seriously. Just enough to reassure himself he still can. And for a few minutes it works. Until they start showing interest. Then something in him shuts down almost immediately. Not because they did anything wrong, but because emotionally unavailable men often confuse novelty with relief. The attention distracts them temporarily, until intimacy starts approaching again. Then the discomfort returns. So now he's sitting across from someone attractive, while emotionally comparing the interaction to a woman he convinced himself he needed distance from, which feels unfair and confusing and vaguely self-destructive. He notices himself becoming colder socially too, less patient, more detached. His friends ask if he's okay and he says, "Yeah, just tired," which technically isn't a lie. He is tired. Emotionally tired, mentally overextended, exhausted from constantly regulating feelings he refuses to name directly. There's a specific kind of loneliness that happens when someone misses a person they're still trying to emotionally resist. It creates internal static. Nothing settles properly. Even pleasure feels thin. One night he's lying in bed scrolling through old messages he told himself he wouldn't reread. He stops at a voice note, just stares at it for a while, doesn't press play immediately, because he already knows hearing her voice is going to ruin his night. Still presses it anyway. That's another thing people don't talk about enough. Sometimes men participate in their own emotional suffering voluntarily. Quietly, almost compulsively, like picking at a bruise. He listens to her laughing halfway through the recording because she forgot what she was trying to say, and something in his chest physically drops. Not metaphorically, actually drops. His throat tightens instantly, and for a few seconds he just sits there staring at the wall, silent, almost annoyed by how deeply his body reacted. You wanted freedom. The thought appears automatically. Another voice answers almost immediately. Then why does this feel like grief? No answer. Just silence. That's usually how these internal conversations go. Not profound. Not cinematic. Just unfinished. Because part of him still doesn't fully trust his own feelings yet. And honestly, emotional suppression can make people deeply disconnected from their own emotional language. He feels things physically long before he can explain them psychologically. That's why the body notices first. The appetite changes. The sleep changes. The tension changes. The breathing changes. Even his apartment feels emotionally different now. Too quiet some nights. Too empty. Then other nights he suddenly craves isolation so intensely he ignores everybody for hours. Contradiction becomes his normal state. He misses intimacy. While feeling relieved nobody currently has emotional access to him. He wants connection, while resenting the vulnerability required for it. He checks her profile, then gets irritated at himself for caring. He wonders if she misses him, then avoids situations where he might actually find out. And underneath all of it is something much less spiritual and much more human. Fear. Not just fear of losing her. Fear of what loving someone exposed inside him. Dependency. Need. Softness. Emotional hunger. The terrifying realization that another human being had started affecting his internal world deeply. Some men can tolerate desire easier than tenderness. Desire feels temporary, manageable, physical. Tenderness lingers. Tenderness follows you into grocery stores, traffic lights, random Tuesday afternoons, half-empty parking lots. Tenderness is hearing someone say your name gently one time and remembering it 6 months later against your will. That's what starts breaking him open slowly. Not dramatic heartbreak. Accumulation. Tiny emotional collisions happening over and over until the body can no longer pretend nothing important happened. And eventually, he starts realizing something uncomfortable. The distance didn't actually create peace inside him. It just delayed confrontation. Now, the distractions are wearing off. Now, his body keeps betraying the emotions his mind is still trying to organize neatly. And somewhere underneath the avoidance, underneath the pride, underneath the emotional confusion, he's beginning to understand something he really didn't want to admit. He didn't just lose the relationship. He lost the version of himself that existed when he allowed himself to feel emotionally close to someone. And now, his nervous system keeps trying to find its way back there, even while his ego is still pretending he never needed it. What really starts breaking him open isn't usually the dramatic memories, not the big fights, not the emotional conversations, not even the goodbye itself. It's the small moments, the stupidly small moments, the kind that didn't even seem important at the time. That's what catches him off guard. Because when the relationship was actually happening, his mind kept focusing on pressure, expectations, fear, the emotional intensity of being needed by someone. But after the silence settles in, his brain starts replaying completely different footage. Tiny moments, ordinary moments, moments he barely reacted to when they were happening. And now, suddenly, they won't leave him alone. He'll be standing in line at a coffee shop and randomly remember the way she used to wipe foam off the edge of his cup with her thumb without interrupting the conversation. That's it. That's the memory. Not some cinematic declaration of love. Just that. And somehow it wrecks him for 20 minutes. Because emotional memory is weird like that. The body doesn't archive relationships according to what was objectively important. It stores emotional safety in details, textures, patterns, micro moments. The nervous system remembers how someone made ordinary life feel. And unfortunately for him, ordinary life now feels noticeably emptier. That realization irritates him at first, because part of him still wants to maintain emotional distance psychologically. He still catches himself trying to minimize things. Maybe I'm just lonely. Maybe I'm romanticizing it. Maybe I only miss the routine. And maybe some of that is true. But there's a difference between missing attention and missing someone's specific presence. His body knows the difference even when his pride doesn't. That's why the memories keep getting more precise, not broader, more specific. He remembers the exact way she used to look at him when he got emotionally quiet. Not pushing, not demanding, just noticing. And honestly, that memory bothers him more now than it used to. Because he realizes how many moments she understood him emotionally while he was still busy defending himself from being understood at all. That kind of delayed realization can make a man physically restless, especially when he starts replaying interactions and noticing things he missed the first time. Like the night she asked, Why do you always pull away right after we get closer? At the time, he got defensive almost immediately. Started talking about stress, timing, needing balance, all the intellectual language emotionally avoidant people use when they feel exposed. But now he remembers her face after he said it. Not angry, just tired. And somehow that's worse, because delayed empathy is brutal. When emotional understanding arrives months after the damage, there's nobody left in the room to explain yourself to. So now he's alone replaying scenes his nervous system apparently recorded in high definition, while his conscious mind was emotionally checked out. That's the unsettling part. He starts realizing how often he was physically present, but emotionally halfway gone already. And once he notices it, he can't unsee it. He remembers moments after intimacy especially. Those moments become unbearably loud later, because emotionally unavailable men often experience closeness and panic simultaneously. At the time, he didn't have language for that. He just knew something inside him tightened after vulnerable moments. So maybe after a deeply connected night together, he suddenly became distant the next morning, colder, distracted, more focused on his phone. Not because the intimacy meant nothing, usually because it meant too much. But that explanation arrives late. At the time, all she experienced was emotional whiplash, warmth, closeness, then sudden withdrawal. And now, he's the one replaying it obsessively. He remembers one specific morning in painful detail. Sunlight through the curtains. Her sitting cross-legged near the edge of the bed drinking coffee. Him pretending to scroll through emails. She looked peaceful, safe with him. That's the part that follows him now. The trust. Not dramatic dependence. Not obsession. Just quiet trust. And he remembers feeling something uncomfortable in response to it. Pressure. Which makes him feel terrible now. Because she wasn't actually pressuring him in that moment. She was just emotionally open. But men who associate intimacy with responsibility sometimes experience tenderness as expectation, even when nobody is demanding anything. So he pulled away emotionally without fully understanding why. Started acting distracted, more reserved. She noticed immediately, of course. Women usually do. Especially women who have spent months learning a man's emotional weather patterns. What's wrong? Nothing. That was always the answer. Nothing. Meanwhile, his entire nervous system was internally overheating from closeness. And now, months later, he's sitting in his apartment replaying her expression after that conversation like his brain refuses to let it go. That's what delayed regret feels like sometimes. Not explosive guilt. Just recurring emotional ambushes. Tiny memories appearing at random times with completely disproportionate emotional force. He'll remember her fixing his jacket collar before they walk into a restaurant once. That memory destroys him unexpectedly. Not because of the gesture itself, because nobody has touched him gently like that since. That's another thing people rarely talk about honestly enough. After emotionally meaningful intimacy, casual attention from other people can start feeling strangely empty. Even attractive people. Even exciting situations. Because emotional specificity cannot be replaced with generic validation. And unfortunately, he's beginning to realize that too late. One night he's cleaning his apartment for no reason. Not real cleaning. Stress cleaning. Opening drawers aggressively. Reorganizing things that don't need reorganizing. His body buzzing with emotional energy he still doesn't know how to process directly. Then he finds one of her hair ties near the bathroom sink. And everything in him pauses instantly. It's ridiculous how fast grief can enter a room. 1 second he's irritated about clutter. Next second, he's staring at a stupid black hair tie like it contains an entire relationship inside it. He almost throws it away. Doesn't. Sets it back down carefully instead. Then just stands there feeling emotionally stupid. That's the word a lot of men use internally when they start feeling vulnerable again. Stupid. Weak. Dramatic. Pathetic. Because many of them were taught emotional attachment is embarrassing once it becomes visible. So now, he's privately haunted by ordinary objects, while publicly pretending he moved on weeks ago. That split starts exhausting him eventually, especially because the memories aren't staying romantic. They're becoming uncomfortably accurate. He's starting to remember moments where she was trying to emotionally reach him and he subtly punished her for it. Not intentionally, maybe, but emotionally. Getting colder after intimacy, withdrawing after vulnerable conversations, acting irritated after feeling emotionally dependent on her. At the time, he thought he was regaining space. Now it looks different. Now it looks like fear. And honestly, that realization bruises his ego badly, because it forces him to confront a version of himself that wasn't emotionally mature enough to handle being deeply loved. Not unloved. Loved. That distinction matters. There's another memory that keeps replaying too. One night she fell asleep on the couch while they were watching something. Nothing emotional happened. No important conversation. She was just asleep. And he remembers looking over at her thinking something terrifyingly soft for half a second. I could really love this person forever. The thought scared him immediately. Not because it felt wrong, because it felt real. So naturally his defenses activated afterward. That's the tragic cycle sometimes. The deeper the emotional truth, the faster the protective behavior appears. And now he understands that retrospectively while sitting alone months later eating takeout in silence. That's what makes delayed masculine grief so psychologically strange. The emotions often arrive out of order. First comes avoidance, then relief, then numbness, then eventually memory starts reopening everything quietly. And memory is patient. It waits until distractions weaken. Then suddenly he's driving home at night replaying one sentence she said 6 months ago with painful clarity. You don't have to disappear every time you're loved. At the time he brushed it off. Now it follows him everywhere. The problem is, by the time emotionally avoidant people fully understand what happened internally, they've often already created external damage they can't undo easily. That realization starts sitting heavier inside him now, because he's beginning to see the full contradiction. He wanted closeness. He absolutely did. But he also kept reacting to closeness like it was a threat to his autonomy. So now, his brain compulsively replays moments searching for understanding after the fact, trying to reconstruct emotional truth from behavioral wreckage. And underneath all of it is one deeply uncomfortable realization growing louder every day. The moments he thought were emotionally insignificant were actually the moments he felt most loved. He just didn't know how to stay present long enough to receive them without panicking. And now those tiny moments have become ghosts. Not dramatic ghosts. Ordinary ghosts. Coffee cups. Traffic lights. Voice notes. Hair ties. Half-finished conversations. The memory of her hand resting absent-mindedly on his chest while she talked. Small things. Small enough to sound meaningless when spoken out loud. But emotionally, those are the memories slowly breaking him apart. At some point, the memories start getting too loud. Not constantly. That's the strange part. Grief like this isn't dramatic every second. Sometimes he feels almost normal for 3 days straight. Productive. Focused. Even relieved. Then something tiny breaks through again, and suddenly the emotional ache is back sitting in the passenger seat beside him like it never left. So naturally, he starts trying to outrun it. Not consciously at first. Most emotionally avoidant people don't wake up and think, "I'm going to suppress my feelings today." It's subtler than that. They just become addicted to momentum. Movement starts feeling safer than stillness. So now his schedule gets strange. Overfilled. He starts saying yes to plans he normally would have avoided. Staying out later. Going to the gym twice in one day sometimes. Taking longer routes home. Keeping background noise on constantly. Anything to avoid emotional stillness. Because stillness keeps leading back to her. And honestly, part of him resents that. That's an ugly truth people don't say enough out loud. Sometimes he misses her and resents her simultaneously. Not because she did something wrong. Because he hates how emotionally affected he still is. He hates that she still exists in his body this way. In his routines. In his reflexes. In the emotional texture of ordinary life. So instead of sitting with the grief honestly, he starts trying to replace the feeling. That's where distraction becomes dangerous. Because for a while, distraction works. Temporarily. He downloads dating apps again. At first mostly out of boredom. Ego-soothing. Curiosity. Just to prove something to himself. That he still has options. That he isn't stuck emotionally. That he can move forward if he wants to. And externally, maybe it even looks convincing. He matches with people easily enough. Starts conversations. Flirts a little. Sometimes he even enjoys it. But then something strange keeps happening. The second emotional depth starts approaching. He mentally checks out. Not dramatically. Quietly. A woman asks him a sincere question and suddenly he feels tired. Not because of her specifically. Because emotionally available attention now feels heavier than it used to. There's a scene that keeps happening in different forms. He's sitting across from someone attractive. The lighting is good. The conversation is objectively fine. And internally, he feels almost nothing. Or worse, he feels guilty. Because part of him keeps comparing every interaction to someone he claimed he needed distance from. That realization unsettles him badly. Especially because he can't explain it logically. He wanted freedom, didn't he? So why does emotional availability from other people suddenly feel exhausting instead of exciting? That's the part nobody explains honestly enough. Once someone emotionally meaningful reaches your deeper emotional layers, surface level connection can start feeling emotionally thin afterward. Even if the person in front of you is objectively wonderful. And honestly, that realization creates shame too. Because now he starts wondering if he ruins something real while trying to protect himself from vulnerability. But instead of fully facing that thought, he distracts again. More work, more movement, more stimulation. His screen time gets embarrassing. Hours disappear. Scrolling, watching random videos, reading comments he doesn't care about, opening apps automatically without even knowing why. His body is overstimulated. His emotional world is unnerved. That combination creates a weird kind of numbness. And numbness can feel deceptively peaceful for a little while. Until it doesn't. Until he gets home late one night after another socially busy day and realizes he hasn't actually felt emotionally connected to anybody in weeks. That realization lands harder than he expects. Because there's a difference between being occupied and being emotionally met. A huge difference. And he's starting to notice the gap now. One night his friends invite him out. He almost says no. forces himself to go anyway. The bar is loud. Everybody's drinking. Someone's telling a story loudly at the table. And outwardly he participates enough. Laughs at the right moments. Makes eye contact. Acts normal. But emotionally, he feels disconnected from the room in a way he can't explain. Like everybody else is fully inside the moment, while part of him is observing everything from several feet away. Then someone asks casually, "So, are you seeing anyone right now?" And his body reacts before his brain does. Tiny pause. Tight chest. Immediate emotional fatigue. "Nah," he says casually. Then takes a sip of his drink too quickly. The conversation moves on. Nobody notices. But internally something feels exposed suddenly. Because the truthful answer would have been more complicated. No, he isn't with her anymore. But emotionally, he hasn't fully left either. And that in-between state starts exhausting him. Especially because he keeps trying to perform emotional detachment externally while privately replaying her voice in his head during quiet moments. That split drains people more than they realize. So eventually, even distraction starts becoming emotionally hollow. The gym doesn't help as much anymore. The nights out feel repetitive. The flirting feels performative. And the strangest part, the more emotionally disconnected he becomes, the less alive everything starts feeling. Not tragic, just flat. Food tastes less exciting. Music stops hitting emotionally. Conversations feel shorter somehow. He notices himself staring at nothing more often. Sitting in parking lots after arriving home. Not wanting to go inside yet. There's one night in particular he'll remember later. He comes home exhausted after spending the entire day keeping himself busy on purpose. Gym in the morning. Work all afternoon. Dinner with friends afterward. Constant motion. He unlocks the apartment door expecting relief. Instead, the silence hits him almost physically. No TV playing in the background. No random conversation from the kitchen. No familiar presence moving through the apartment. Just stillness. And suddenly, all the distractions from the day stop buffering the emotional reality underneath everything. He drops his keys on the counter. Stands there for a second too long. Then instinctively reaches for his phone. Not to text her. Just to look. Which honestly might be worse. He opens her profile quietly. Doesn't interact. Doesn't like anything. Doesn't message. Just looks. People do this all the time after emotional separation. Pretend they're detached while secretly maintaining tiny invisible forms of connection. And honestly, the behavior itself isn't even the saddest part. The saddest part is the emotional hunger underneath it. Because what he actually misses isn't even constant communication. It's emotional familiarity. The feeling of someone existing naturally inside his daily life. That's what replacement attempts fail to recreate. You can replace stimulation very easily. You cannot easily replace emotional significance. So now he's caught in this strange cycle. Distract. Feel temporary relief. Crush emotionally afterward. Distract again. And each cycle leaves him slightly emptier. That's when the emotional irritation starts getting worse too. He becomes shorter with people. Less patient. More emotionally withdrawn. Not because he consciously wants to hurt anyone. His emotional bandwidth is just collapsing quietly underneath all the avoidance. And somewhere deep down, he knows the distractions are failing now. That realization scares him more than the grief itself sometimes. Because if distraction stops working, then eventually he has to actually face what's underneath everything. Missing her, regretting things, feeling emotionally exposed, admitting the connection mattered, and maybe worst of all, admitting he's lonelier than he pretended to be. There's an internal conversation that starts happening more frequently now. You miss her. No, I miss the comfort. Then why does nobody else feel comforting? Silence. That's usually where the conversation ends. Because deep emotional honesty starts threatening the protective identity he built around emotional self-sufficiency. A lot of men can admit desire, attraction, even heartbreak eventually. But dependency, emotional need, that's harder. That feels dangerous. So instead he keeps trying to intellectualize the emptiness. Maybe I just need time. Maybe I need to focus on myself more. Maybe I'm just emotionally drained. Again, some of that might even be partially true. But underneath all the explanations is a much simpler human reality. He lost someone who emotionally reached him deeply, and no amount of stimulation is fully replacing that. Not the gym, not the dating apps, not the attention, not the noise, not the constant movement. Because emotional connection isn't interchangeable once it settles into the nervous system deeply enough. And now, he's beginning to understand something uncomfortable. The more he runs from the grief, the more emotionally disconnected he becomes from himself too. Not just from her, from himself, from softness, from presence, from emotional openness, from the version of him that briefly existed when he stopped guarding himself all the time. And honestly, that's the part that finally starts terrifying him. Because now the distractions aren't just failing to numb the loss. They're revealing how emotionally empty his life feels without genuine connection inside it. And for the first time since the separation, he's beginning to suspect the problem was never simply the relationship. It was how deeply intimacy exposed everything inside him he still didn't know how to hold. At some point, the grief changes shape. It stops feeling like he simply misses her. Now it starts feeling more uncomfortable than that, because he begins realizing she understood things about him emotionally before he did. And honestly, that realization can make a man feel almost defensive even after the relationship is over. Not because he hates being known, because being deeply seen without fully understanding yourself yet can feel terrifying. Especially for someone who built their entire emotional survival around staying unreadable. That's the irony. A lot of emotionally avoidant men secretly want intimacy very badly. They want closeness, softness, safety, someone who understands them without needing everything explained perfectly. But when they finally experience it, their nervous system interprets the exposure as danger. Not consciously, their body just starts reacting. Withdrawal, irritation, distance, emotional static. And now, months later, he's sitting alone replaying moments where she noticed things he tried incredibly hard to hide. Not huge things either. Tiny things. The subtle exhaustion underneath his personality. How quiet he became after stressful days. The way his jaw tightened when he was emotionally overwhelmed. How he stopped making eye contact when conversations got too vulnerable. At the time, those observations irritated him. Now they haunt him, because he realizes she wasn't judging him in those moments. She was trying to understand him. That distinction arrives late sometimes. Painfully late. There's one memory he keeps revisiting whether he wants to or not. They were in the kitchen one evening. Nothing dramatic happened. She was leaning against the counter eating something absent-mindedly while he pretended to answer work emails. Pretended being the important word, because he wasn't actually reading anything. He was emotionally overloaded and trying to disappear into his phone without admitting it. And after a few minutes, she looked at him gently and said, "You get really far away sometimes, even when you're right here." That sentence hit him strangely hard. Not outwardly. Outwardly, he stayed calm, maybe slightly annoyed. But internally, something panicked. Because she was right. And emotionally avoidant people often experience accuracy as intrusion. Not because the other person is being invasive. Because being emotionally understood removes their ability to hide inside vagueness. So he got defensive. Not loudly. Just enough. I'm just tired. Another sentence men use when they don't know how to explain emotional overwhelm. And technically maybe he was tired. But not physically. Emotionally. Tired of holding himself together. Tired of feeling emotionally visible. Tired of needing someone more than he wanted to admit. But he couldn't say any of that yet. So instead he withdrew emotionally for the rest of the night. And now that memory keeps replaying with unbearable clarity because he finally sees what was actually happening underneath it. She wasn't asking him to become perfect. She was trying to meet him emotionally, and he reacted like he was being cornered. That realization bruises something deep inside him, because delayed self-awareness can feel incredibly humiliating, especially when you start recognizing how many times someone approached you with care, and you interpreted it as pressure. There's another memory too, one he avoids thinking about because it makes his chest tighten almost instantly. One night she touched his face during an argument. Not dramatically, not romantically, just softly, like she suddenly realized he was more overwhelmed than angry. And for half a second, he wanted to collapse emotionally into the tenderness of it. That's the truth. The body wants comfort before the ego interrupts. But almost immediately after feeling that softness, his defenses activated again. He pulled away slightly, crossed his arms, started talking logically instead of honestly. Because for some men, tenderness feels dangerously disarming, like losing emotional control. And now, months later, he's replaying that exact moment, realizing how badly he wanted the intimacy he simultaneously resisted. That contradiction starts becoming impossible to ignore now. He wanted her close. He absolutely did. But he also wanted protection from how deeply she affected him. Both things existed together. That's what made him emotionally inconsistent. One day warm and emotionally open, the next distant and unreachable. Not because his feelings disappeared overnight, because intimacy kept colliding with fear internally. And honestly, he didn't fully understand that while it was happening. That's another painful truth. People often imagine emotionally avoidant behavior as fully calculated. Sometimes it is, but a lot of the time it's reactive. The body reacting before the person fully understands why. That's why his memories are becoming so emotionally disturbing now. Because he's finally seeing how often she noticed emotional realities he was still actively denying. Like how anxious he became after closeness. How emotionally unreachable he got when he felt dependent on her. How he suddenly needed space right after feeling deeply connected. At the time, he explained these reactions intellectually. Now they look different. Now they look like fear disguised as independence. And once he sees that, he can't stop seeing it. There is a particular kind of regret that comes from realizing someone loved you with more emotional accuracy than you loved yourself. That regret sits differently in the body. It's quieter than heartbreak, more shameful somehow. Because now he's not just grieving the relationship. He's grieving all the moments he emotionally abandoned himself while trying to maintain control. And unfortunately, she witnessed many of those moments up close. That vulnerability starts haunting him too. Not because she used it against him, because she didn't. That's almost the harder part. She saw his shutdowns, his fear, his emotional confusion. And instead of humiliating him for it, she often responded with softness, patience, curiosity, care, and at the time, some part of him distrusted that care instinctively. Because people who grew up emotionally guarded sometimes struggle to believe tenderness can exist without hidden conditions attached to it. So now, he's lying awake at night replaying moments where she offered emotional safety, and he instinctively moved away from it. There's one memory in particular he keeps circling. He had a terrible week emotionally, didn't really talk about it, just became quieter, more irritable, more emotionally absent. One night she sat beside him on the couch and said carefully, "You don't always have to disappear when things get heavy." And instead of feeling relieved, he felt exposed. That's the heartbreaking part. Sometimes emotionally unavailable people experience love as emotional exposure before they experience it as safety. So his instinct wasn't to lean closer. It was to regain control, change the subject, withdraw slightly, pretend he was fine. And now he finally understands how lonely that probably felt for her too. That realization lands hard, because he's beginning to recognize something painful. She wasn't asking for perfection. Most of the time, she was simply asking for emotional presence. And presence was exactly what terrified him once the feelings became real enough. There is an internal dialogue that starts happening more now. She wasn't trying to control you. Then why did it feel suffocating sometimes? Silence. Then eventually, because she could see through you. That answer unsettles him deeply, because underneath all the emotional withdrawal, all the distancing, all the confusion, was a very human fear. What if someone sees how emotionally fragile I actually am underneath all this control? That's the thing people misunderstand about a lot of emotionally avoidant men. Many of them don't feel emotionally empty. They feel emotionally unsafe. There's a difference. And when someone finally reaches the softer parts underneath their defenses, their entire internal system can start reacting unpredictably. Closeness feels good, then terrifying, then necessary, then overwhelming, back and forth, until eventually they create distance trying to regulate emotions they never learned how to hold properly. And now, he's sitting with the aftermath of that, realizing how many moments she offered connection while he was internally fighting the vulnerability of receiving it. That's what starts breaking him open now. Not spiritual awakening, not mystical transformation, just painful emotional honesty arriving late. The realization that she saw the exhausted version of him, the scared version, the emotionally overwhelmed version, the version that kept pretending he needed less than he actually did. And despite all of that, she stayed emotionally present for longer than he expected. That's the part his mind keeps returning to. Not perfection, not fantasy, just the deeply unsettling experience of being genuinely seen by another human being, and not rejected immediately for it. Because once someone experiences that kind of intimacy, ordinary emotional detachment starts feeling unbearably hollow afterward. And now, he's beginning to understand something he couldn't admit before. Part of what scared him so badly about her was how close she got to the truth. At first, the silence felt controlled. That's important to admit honestly, because when he pulled away, when the messages slowed down, when the emotional distance became real, part of him felt safer. Safer inside the quiet. Safer inside the space. Safer without constant emotional exposure. And honestly, after intense emotional connection, silence can temporarily feel like recovery to someone emotionally overwhelmed. No difficult conversations. No vulnerability. No feeling emotionally observed all the time. Just distance. And in the beginning, He mistook that emotional numbness for peace. A lot of people do, especially people who learned to associate emotional intensity with danger. So, for a while, the silence even fed his ego a little. He told himself things like, maybe this was the healthier choice. Maybe I was getting too emotionally dependent. Maybe I just needed to regain myself. And again, some of that may have even been partially true. That's what makes these situations psychologically messy. The emotions aren't fake. The fear isn't fake either. But eventually the silence changes texture. That's the part nobody prepares him for. Because silence feels very different once the nervous system realizes the connection might actually be gone. At first, the distance feels reversible, temporary, like he could always reach out later if he really wanted to. That illusion comforts him more than he realizes. But then days become weeks. Weeks become longer stretches of emotional absence. And slowly something starts happening underneath the surface. The silence stops feeling like control. Now it starts feeling like loss. And unfortunately, that realization often arrives very quietly, not during dramatic moments, during ordinary ones. Like standing in line somewhere and realizing he hasn't heard her voice in over a month. Or reaching for his phone after seeing something funny and suddenly remembering there's no longer an active place for that instinct to go. That's when the silence starts becoming physical. Heavy, not heartbreaking all at once, just persistently heavy, like emotional pressure building slowly behind the ribs. He still doesn't fully know what to do with the feeling though. That's the problem. Because emotionally avoidant people often know how to create distance long before they know how to repair it. So instead of reaching out directly, he starts looking indirectly, quietly, embarrassingly. He checks her social media more often than he admits to himself. Not obsessively at first, just casually, then less casually. He notices when she posts later at night, notices when she changes her profile picture, notices when she seems happy. That last one bothers him more than expected. Not because he wants her miserable, because some hidden part of him assumed the emotional connection still lived inside her the same way it lived inside him. And seeing signs of her continuing her life creates this strange emotional disorientation, especially because externally, he's still pretending he's detached. That's the exhausting part. The performance of indifference, acting normal around friends, acting emotionally unavailable, acting unaffected. Meanwhile, he's privately analyzing the emotional meaning behind a song she posted on her story 3 days ago. It's almost humiliating when he becomes aware of himself doing it, because he used to think emotionally attached people looked irrational. Now, he understands attachment from the inside. And honestly, it's messier than he imagined. There are nights where he opens her profile with no intention of interacting. Just looking, checking, almost like emotional reassurance. Still there, still existing, still reachable maybe. That maybe becomes dangerous. Because now silence isn't calming him anymore. It's feeding uncertainty. And uncertainty makes emotionally avoidant people behave in incredibly contradictory ways. He wants to know if she misses him, but he avoids asking directly. He wants connection, but the vulnerability required for reconnection still terrifies him. He misses her presence deeply, but his ego keeps interrupting the grief with pride. So now, he exists inside this emotionally exhausting middle ground, watching from a distance, thinking constantly, saying nothing. That kind of emotional suppression slowly starts leaking into the rest of his life too. His attention span worsens. His patience gets thinner. Even when he's around people, part of him feels mentally elsewhere now. There's one moment that really unsettles him. He's out with friends one night. Everybody's talking loudly. Someone tells a joke. He laughs automatically. Then immediately afterward realizes he hasn't genuinely relaxed in months. Not fully. That realization lands strangely hard, because he starts recognizing how much emotional energy it takes to maintain internal distance from someone you still care about. It's exhausting pretending not to feel things, especially when the feelings never actually left. That's the thing he's finally beginning to understand. Avoidance didn't remove the attachment. It only removed the external interaction. Internally, the bond kept living. Inside memory, inside habit, inside the body. And once he realizes that, the silence becomes harder to tolerate. There is another humiliating thing he starts doing too. Looking for her in indirect ways. Mutual friends, old photos, tiny digital traces. Not because he consciously wants to stalk her life. Because emotionally disconnected men often maintain invisible forms of attachment long after communication ends. Quiet emotional proximity. That's what this is. He tells himself he's just curious. But curiosity doesn't usually tighten your chest at 1 a.m. Curiosity doesn't make you stare at old pictures for 15 minutes while pretending you're emotionally unaffected. There is a specific night that shifts something inside him. He can't sleep again. The apartment feels too quiet. His thoughts feel loud. So naturally he grabs his phone, starts scrolling mindlessly, then somehow ends up rereading old conversations again. And there's one message that stops him cold. A simple one. I miss you when you disappear emotionally, even when you're still here. That sentence hits completely differently now. At the time, he thought she was being dramatic. Now it feels painfully accurate. Because he finally understands something he refused to see before. He had already started emotionally leaving long before the actual separation happened. And deep down, she felt it. That realization creates a different kind of guilt. Not explosive guilt. Quiet guilt. The kind that sits in your chest while you stare at old messages alone in the dark. Because now, he starts recognizing how lonely the relationship may have felt for her at times too. How confusing his inconsistency probably was. Warm one day, distant the next, emotionally open during intimacy, then unreachable afterward. And the painful part is, he often didn't fully understand his own behavior while it was happening. He just knew closeness made him feel emotionally exposed. So he pulled away whenever the feelings became too real. Now, he's the one experiencing the emotional consequences of that distance fully. That's the irony. Silence eventually forces emotionally avoidant people to sit with the emotions they spent the relationship trying to outrun. And unfortunately, those emotions grow louder without distraction. There is an internal conversation happening more frequently now. Text her. No. Why? Because what if she doesn't care anymore? That question terrifies him more than he expected. Because as long as the silence remained unbroken, he could still imagine emotional possibility. Reaching out risks reality. And reality might confirm the loss became permanent while he was busy emotionally hiding from it. So instead, he stays silent longer, even though the silence is starting to hurt him now too. That's the contradiction. He fears vulnerability, but he's becoming emotionally starved without connection. He wants relief, but the only thing that might actually relieve the grief now requires emotional honesty. And honesty is exactly what he's been avoiding. There are moments where his body almost reaches for her before his pride intervenes. Typing her name into the message bar, writing half a sentence, deleting it immediately. Sometimes he just stares at the blank screen afterward feeling ridiculous. A grown man emotionally paralyzed by feelings he still struggles to name directly. But the truth underneath all of it is painfully simple. He misses her. Not abstractly. Not spiritually. Humanly. He misses her voice interrupting silence. Her presence inside ordinary days. The emotional familiarity. The feeling of someone existing naturally inside his life. And now, the silence that once felt protective feels like emotional starvation. That's when the emotional unraveling deepens. Because once silence stops feeling powerful, he can no longer pretend distance solved the problem. Now, he has to face something much harder. The connection survived the separation longer than his defenses expected it to. And somewhere deep down, he's beginning to realize the person he was trying to escape emotionally was never really her. It was the vulnerability inside himself she kept awakening every time she got close. At some point, the grief stops being only about her. That realization sneaks up on him slowly. Because for months, maybe longer, he framed everything around the relationship itself. The closeness became overwhelming. The emotions became too intense. He needed space. He needed to focus on himself. That was the narrative. And maybe parts of it were true. But eventually another realization starts pressing through the cracks underneath all the avoidance. He doesn't fully recognize himself anymore either. That part is harder to talk about honestly. Because it's one thing to admit you miss someone. It's another thing entirely to admit you've become emotionally disconnected from yourself in the process of trying not to need them. That realization doesn't arrive dramatically. It shows up in weird moments. Quiet moments. He notices he laughs less naturally now. Not visibly, maybe. People around him probably can't tell. But internally, he notices the difference. His reactions feel thinner somehow. More performative. Like he's participating in life instead of actually feeling inside it. One afternoon, someone at work makes a joke that normally would have genuinely made him laugh. Instead, he gives one of those automatic half smiles people use when they're mentally somewhere else. And afterward, he catches himself thinking, when was the last time I actually felt present? That thought unsettles him. Because emotionally avoidant people often survive by staying mentally ahead of their feelings. Planning, managing, distracting, containing. But eventually, that constant emotional management creates another problem. They stop feeling fully alive inside their own lives. And now, he's beginning to notice it everywhere. The gym feels repetitive. Conversations feel emotionally shallow. Even attraction feels muted. Not absent. Muted. Like something inside him shut down partially and forgot how to reopen. That's the dangerous stage. Because emotional suppression doesn't only block pain eventually. It starts dulling joy too. And once he notices that, he can't stop noticing it. There's a specific kind of loneliness that happens when someone realizes they've spent years emotionally surviving instead of emotionally living. That loneliness hits differently. It isn't dramatic heartbreak. It's more like sitting in your apartment at midnight staring at absolutely nothing while the TV keeps playing in the background untouched. That kind of loneliness. He starts having strange little collapse moments. Not full breakdowns. Just moments where his emotional exhaustion suddenly becomes visible to himself. Like sitting in his parked car for 20 extra minutes after getting home, because going inside feels emotionally heavy for some reason. Or opening messages from friends and feeling too drained to answer even though he technically wants connection. Or cleaning the apartment aggressively at 1 a.m. because his nervous system feels overloaded and he doesn't know where to put the energy. Those moments start happening more often now. And honestly, they scare him a little. Because for a long time, emotional detachment felt functional, efficient. Now it just feels empty. That's the shift. The avoidance strategy that once protected him emotionally is starting to feel like emotional imprisonment instead. And the worst part is, he's beginning to realize this didn't start with her. She just exposed it. That realization creates a weird mix of grief and clarity. Because now he starts looking back at himself more honestly. Not just the relationship. Himself. The patterns. The shutdowns. The distancing. The constant need to emotionally regain control after intimacy. And underneath all of it, he sees something uncomfortable. He has spent most of his life treating vulnerability like a threat instead of a human need. That realization bruises his identity badly. Especially because externally, he probably looked fine for years. Responsible. Independent. Calm under pressure. A lot of emotionally avoidant men become extremely good at functioning externally while emotionally disappearing internally. People admire them for it sometimes. Meanwhile, they secretly feel disconnected from huge parts of themselves. That's why intimacy affected him so deeply. Not because she was magically perfect. Because closeness started confronting emotional absences he had learned to normalize. And now that she's gone, those absences feel louder than ever. One night he's folding laundry half-heartedly while listening to music. A random song comes on that she used to play in the car. Instantly his chest tightens. He skips the song immediately. Then, 2 seconds later, goes back and restarts it. That contradiction right there says everything. Part of him still avoids the emotion. Another part is tired of running from it. So he sits there on the floor listening quietly while memories start surfacing again. Her singing badly on purpose. Her hand tapping against the steering wheel. The way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. And suddenly he feels this overwhelming sadness that has almost nothing to do with the breakup itself. It's deeper than that. He misses the version of himself that existed when he was emotionally open with her. Not perfectly open, but more open than usual. More human. More connected. Less guarded. That realization almost breaks him. Because now he sees the full tragedy underneath everything. The emotional walls he thought were protecting him were also separating him from his own capacity to feel alive. There is an internal dialogue happening more often now. You were protecting yourself. From what? Silence. Then eventually, being hurt. Another silence. But were you happy? That question lingers. Because honestly, he doesn't know how to answer it anymore. A lot of men mistake emotional control for emotional stability. They aren't the same thing. Control can look calm externally while everything internally remains disconnected. And now, his body is starting to reject the numbness he once depended on. That's why the emotional exhaustion keeps intensifying. It takes enormous energy to suppress attachment continuously, to miss someone while pretending you don't, to crave intimacy while fearing it, to want emotional closeness while reflexively pulling away every time it becomes real. Eventually, the contradiction starts tearing holes in your identity, and he feels that happening now. He notices how emotionally flat he becomes around people lately. Less curiosity, less warmth, less patience. Not because he's cruel, because chronic emotional suppression eventually narrows people psychologically. The emotional range shrinks. Everything becomes either too much or not enough. That's why he keeps sitting alone at night feeling this strange emotional ache he can't fully describe. It's grief, loneliness, regret, exhaustion, but it's also something else. Mourning the emotional self he abandoned trying to stay safe. That realization comes to him one night almost accidentally. He's sitting in darkness scrolling through old pictures he told himself he shouldn't still care about. There's one photo where he looks genuinely relaxed beside her. Not posed, not performative, just relaxed. And seeing it suddenly hits him harder than expected, because he realizes how rare that expression actually was for him. How rarely he allowed himself to soften fully around anyone. Then another realization follows immediately after. And I still ran from it. That thought wrecks him quietly, not outwardly. No dramatic breakdown. Just him sitting there staring at the screen, feeling emotionally exposed to himself. Because now he understands something painful. Part of him spent years craving emotional safety, while another part sabotaged it every time it appeared. Not intentionally maybe, but repeatedly, automatically. Like his nervous system trusted emotional distance more than emotional peace. And honestly, that's difficult to confront, because once he sees the pattern clearly, he can no longer fully blame circumstances anymore. Now he has to face himself, his fear, his avoidance, his emotional inconsistency, his inability to stay emotionally present once love became real enough to matter deeply. That level of self-awareness can feel brutal at first, especially because emotionally avoidant people often carry secret shame underneath the detachment. Shame about needing people, shame about emotional dependency, shame about vulnerability. So now every realization feels emotionally exposing, but strangely, also relieving. Because for the first time in a long time, he's no longer really analyzing the relationship. He's finally seeing his own emotional landscape honestly. Messy, contradictory, wounded, human, and somewhere in the middle of all that confusion, a terrifying thought starts forming quietly inside him. Maybe I wasn't protecting myself all those years. Maybe I was abandoning myself. That thought changes something. Not instantly, not magically. He still avoids sometimes, still suppresses, still gets scared by closeness. But the identity he built around emotional detachment is beginning to crack now. And once that crack appears, it becomes impossible to fully return to the numbness that existed before. Because now he's seen what the avoidance actually cost him. Not just her, himself. The hardest part isn't realizing he loved her. The hardest part is realizing she probably suffered while he was figuring that out. That truth lands slowly, almost reluctantly, because for a long time, he framed the entire relationship through his own internal confusion, his overwhelm, his fear, his need for space, his emotional inconsistency. And to be fair, those things were real. He wasn't pretending to struggle. But eventually another layer of awareness starts opening underneath all that self-protection. And unfortunately, that layer includes her pain. Not abstractly, specifically. That's what begins haunting him now. Specific moments, specific expressions, specific silences, specific emotional reactions he dismissed too quickly while trying to protect himself from vulnerability. And once those memories start resurfacing with empathy attached to them, he can't escape them anymore. There's one memory in particular he keeps replaying. She asked him a very simple question one night. Are you still emotionally in this with me? That was it. No screaming, no manipulation, no dramatic scene, just exhaustion in her voice. And he remembers how fast his chest tightened when she asked it, how immediately defensive he became internally. Because emotionally avoidant people often hear emotional accountability as emotional pressure, especially when they already feel overwhelmed by their own feelings. So instead of answering honestly, he withdrew, started talking vaguely, avoided eye contact, said something frustratingly unclear like, I just have a lot going on right now. And at the time, part of him genuinely believed that was the best he could do emotionally. Now he remembers her face after he said it. That quiet disappointment. Not angry anymore, just hurt. And somehow that expression follows him harder than any argument ever did. Because delayed empathy is cruel like that. You don't just remember what happened. You suddenly feel what the other person might have experienced while it was happening. That's the shift occurring inside him now. He's no longer only analyzing his own emotional fear. He's beginning to understand what it feels like to stand on the other side of emotional inconsistency. And honestly, that realization creates shame. Not toxic shame. Not self-hatred. Just painful human shame. The kind that appears when someone finally sees the emotional consequences of their behavior clearly. Because confusion still affects people. Even sincere confusion. That's the part he didn't fully understand before. He thought because he wasn't intentionally trying to hurt her, the damage somehow counted less. But emotional uncertainty has weight. Mixed signals have weight. Withdrawal has weight. Becoming cold after intimacy has weight. Especially when the other person keeps trying to love you through the inconsistency. Now he sees that. And once he sees it, the memories become difficult to sit with. He remembers all the little moments where she was trying to emotionally locate him and couldn't. The pauses after vulnerable conversations. The subtle panic in her voice when he became emotionally distant again. The way she started asking, "Did I do something wrong?" That question destroys him now. Because most of the time, she didn't. He was just overwhelmed by closeness and didn't know how to explain it without emotionally shutting down. But from her perspective, it probably felt personal. That realization hits him in waves sometimes, especially late at night. There's one evening where he's lying in bed, unable to sleep again. His phone brightness low, apartment completely silent. And for some reason, he starts remembering small emotional moments in sequence. Her asking if he was okay. Her trying to understand his withdrawal. Her becoming quieter over time. More careful. More anxious around his emotional distance. And suddenly, he realizes something devastating. She adapted herself emotionally around his inconsistency for far too long. That thought sits heavily in his chest. Because now he understands the relationship didn't only affect him. She was carrying emotional confusion too, trying to decode his silences, trying not to trigger his withdrawal, trying to love someone who sometimes disappeared emotionally right when intimacy deepened. And honestly, that's exhausting. He sees that now. Too late maybe, but genuinely. There is an internal dialogue that starts happening more frequently. You were trying your best. Was I? Silence. I was overwhelmed. Yeah, but she was hurting too. That's the uncomfortable middle ground he's finally entering. No longer villainizing himself, but no longer excusing himself automatically either. Just honesty. Messy honesty. The kind where the truths exist together at the same time. He was scared, and she still got hurt. Both things matter. That's what mature self-awareness starts feeling like eventually. Not self-destructs. Not denial. Just the painful ability to hold complexity without immediately running from it. There's another memory he keeps replaying obsessively now. One morning, after they spent an emotionally intimate night together, he became distant almost immediately. Quieter, more distracted, emotionally unreachable. At the time, he barely questioned the behavior. His nervous system felt overwhelmed after closeness, so he instinctively pulled back. That pattern felt normal to him. Now, he sees the moment differently. He remembers her sitting beside him trying not to look hurt by the sudden shift. Trying to act casual. trying not to ask for reassurance she probably desperately needed. And he hates that memory now, because he can finally see how emotionally confusing that must have felt. Warmth, connection, safety, then sudden emotional coldness the next morning. No explanation, just distance. And the painful truth is, he probably left her alone inside emotional realities he himself helped create. That realization cuts deeply, because emotionally avoidant people often don't fully understand how powerful intimacy becomes once emotional trust is involved. To them, the withdrawal feels temporary, internal, private, but to the other person, the withdrawal changes the emotional atmosphere completely. And now, he understands she felt that shift every time. Probably more than he realized. There's a specific kind of regret that comes from realizing someone kept trying to meet you emotionally while you kept disappearing inside yourself. Not maliciously, not consciously, but repeatedly. And repetition matters. Even unintentional patterns leave emotional bruises. That truth becomes impossible for him to ignore now, especially because he's beginning to understand something even harder. Some of the pain she experienced likely came from loving him while he was emotionally split against himself. Part wanting intimacy, part terrified of it, part wanting closeness, part resenting how vulnerable closeness made him feel. Living inside the contradiction affected both of them, not just him. And honestly, that realization humbles him deeply, because for a long time, he saw himself primarily as someone struggling emotionally. Now, he's starting to understand he also became someone difficult to emotionally feel safe with at times. That's painful to admit, especially for men who never intended to become emotionally harmful. But intention and impact are not always the same thing. That distinction changes him slowly. He starts recognizing how much emotional labor she probably carried silently. The overthinking, the waiting, the trying to understand him without pushing too hard, the constant emotional adjusting around his shutdowns. And suddenly her exhaustion near the end makes sense to him in a way it didn't before. That realization breaks something open internally. Because now the relationship no longer looks like a story where he was simply misunderstood. Now he sees two nervous systems struggling inside the same emotional space. Two people hurting differently. Two people trying, failing, misreading each other, loving each other imperfectly. That perspective softens him, not into instant wisdom, just into honesty. There's one realization in particular that keeps following him now. She often loved him through emotional phases he barely understood himself. And instead of appreciating that fully, he sometimes punished her with distance because the intimacy scared him. That truth is difficult to carry, but he carries it now anyway, because avoiding it no longer feels emotionally possible. There's a moment late one night where he almost texts her, not to get her back, not even to fix anything necessarily, just to finally acknowledge reality honestly, to say, "I understand now why it hurt you." But he doesn't send anything. Not yet. Maybe because shame still gets there first. Maybe because he still doesn't trust his own emotional consistency completely. Maybe because part of him fears hearing how much damage the confusion actually caused. So instead, he sits quietly in the dark holding the realization alone. And honestly, that might be the first truly emotionally accountable moment of his life. Not because he suddenly became perfect, but because he finally stopped making himself the only person inside the story. And once that happens, the grief changes again. Now, it's no longer just about missing her. It's about grieving the version of himself that didn't know how to stay emotionally present long enough to love someone without making them carry his confusion too. This chapter is the emotional tipping point, where the desire to reach out becomes stronger than the desire to avoid. But shame, fear, and emotional uncertainty still keep stopping him at the last second. Eventually, the silence becomes unbearable in a very specific way. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just exhausting. Because now every day starts feeling emotionally unfinished. He thinks about texting her constantly, not every second, not obsessively, but in those strange in-between moments where the mind relaxes for half a second and the truth slips through before the defenses return. Driving home, standing in line somewhere, lying awake till late, hearing something funny, having a terrible day, and instinctively wanting to tell the one person who used to understand his emotional weather without needing everything explained. That instinct keeps happening, and every time it does, something inside him tightens afterward. Because wanting to reach out is one thing. Actually doing it, that's different. That requires vulnerability, accountability, the possibility of rejection. And honestly, he's terrified of all three. There is a particular kind of emotional paralysis that happens when someone finally understands what they lost, while simultaneously feeling unsure they deserve access to it anymore. That's where he is now, caught between longing and shame. And shame is quieter than people think. It doesn't always scream, "You're a terrible person." Sometimes shame just whispers, "Don't bother her. You already hurt her enough. What if she's finally peaceful without you? What if hearing from you ruins her healing? What if she moved on? What if she didn't?" That last question especially, because secretly, part of him hopes she still feels the connection to, and another part feels guilty for even wanting that. That contradiction exhausts him emotionally. There are nights where he opens the message thread and just stares at it. No typing, no plan, just staring, as if his body arrived before his courage did. Sometimes he scrolls upward through old conversations again, not intentionally trying to hurt himself, just trying to feel close to her for a few minutes without risking actual contact. And honestly, that behavior starts making him feel pathetic. Not because it is pathetic, because emotional vulnerability still embarrasses him even now. Especially now. There's one night in particular that almost breaks him. It's late, maybe 2 a.m. The apartment is dark except for the light from his phone. He's rereading old messages again, even though he promised himself he'd stop doing that. And suddenly he notices something he somehow missed before. How emotionally patient she actually was. The reassurance, the softness, the attempts to understand him gently instead of forcing him open. And for a few seconds, he physically covers his face with his hand because the guilt hits so suddenly. Not guilt in a manipulative way. Human guilt. The kind that appears when delayed emotional clarity finally catches up to someone. He whispers to himself quietly, "Why couldn't I just say what I felt?" No answer comes immediately. Then eventually another thought appears. Because you were scared. That answer should comfort him, maybe. Instead, it makes him sad. Because fear explains behavior. It doesn't erase consequences. And now, he's sitting there realizing how many moments he chose emotional distance while secretly wanting closeness the entire time. That contradiction becomes impossible to live inside forever. Eventually, something has to give. So now he starts drafting messages. Not sending them. Drafting them. That's an important distinction. Emotionally avoidant people often rehearse vulnerability privately long before they can express it out loud. So his notes app starts filling with unsent honesty. "I miss you. I understand things differently now. I'm sorry for how confusing I became. You mattered more than I admitted. Then 10 minutes later, he deletes everything. Because immediately after emotional openness comes panic again. What if it's selfish to contact her? What if he's only lonely? What if he reaches out and realizes nothing changed? What if she responds kindly? That last one unsettles him more than rejection sometimes. Because kindness would break him open emotionally. Coldness he could defend against. Anger he could understand. But kindness, after all the confusion, after all the distance, that level of grace would force him to fully confront how deeply she cared. And honestly, part of him still doesn't know how to emotionally receive care without feeling exposed by it. There is an internal dialogue happening constantly now. Text her and say what? The truth. I don't even fully understand the truth yet. That's the frustrating part. His emotions no longer feel hidden from him, but they still don't feel organized either. He knows he misses her, knows the connection mattered, knows the silence hurts, but translating emotional realization into actual communication feels terrifying. Because now there's real emotional risk involved. And emotionally avoidant men often prefer private suffering over vulnerable exposure. Private pain feels safer somehow. At least inside private pain, control still exists. But sending the message, that transfers emotional power outward again. So he hesitates. Again, and again, and again. Meanwhile, the emotional tension keeps building. There's one afternoon where he almost impulsively calls her. He's having an awful day. Nothing catastrophic. Just emotionally heavy. Everything irritating him. Nothing feeling right. His chest tight in that familiar way. And suddenly all he wants is her voice. Not solutions. Not relationship talk. Just her voice. That realization hits him hard. Because emotionally independent people aren't supposed to need comfort this badly. At least that's what he taught himself for years. So instead of calling, he drives round for almost an hour listening to music too loudly again. Trying to regulate himself alone. Trying to prove he still can. But halfway through the drive, another realization appears quietly. I don't want to keep surviving relationships like this. That thought changes something internally. Not perfectly, not instantly, but it weakens the avoidance. Because now he's no longer only grieving her. He's grieving the emotional habits inside himself that keep turning love into loss. That awareness makes the urge to reach out stronger. But unfortunately, so does shame. Shame about the mixed signals, the withdrawal, the confusion, the emotional inconsistency. He starts imagining how she experienced everything, waiting for replies, trying to understand his silence, wondering if she was asking for too much when all she wanted was emotional presence. And suddenly reaching out feels almost unfair, like reopening a wound he created. That thought stops him repeatedly. Especially because emotionally avoidant men often underestimate their emotional impact until much later. Now he understands it. Too late maybe, but deeply. There's a moment where he types, "You were right about me disappearing emotionally." He stares at the sentence for a long time, his thumb hovering over send. Then panic arrives again. Not dramatic panic. Quiet panic. The kind that sounds like, what if she's happier now? What if hearing from me only confuses her again? What if I still don't know how to love properly? What if I heard her twice? So he deletes the message. Again. And afterward the silence in the room feels almost unbearable. Because now the conflict inside him is fully exposed. He wants closeness. He fears closeness. He wants forgiveness. He fears accountability. He wants connection. He fears being emotionally seen again. all at the same time. That's the reality people rarely describe honestly. Emotional awakening doesn't suddenly make someone fearless. Sometimes it just makes them painfully aware of their fear. And honestly, that awareness can feel worse before it gets better. There are nights now where he lies awake replaying imagined conversations with her. Not fantasy reconciliation scenes. Messier than that. Awkward pauses. Half-finished honesty. Trying to explain emotional confusion without sounding manipulative. Trying to express regret without making himself the victim. In his head, the conversations never sound smooth, because real vulnerability rarely does. Sometimes in the imagined conversation, she's quiet. Sometimes angry. Sometimes kind. Sometimes already emotionally gone. That possibility devastates him quietly, because now he finally understands something he avoided confronting for a long time. Love is not guaranteed to wait forever while someone figures themselves out emotionally. That truth matures him painfully. There is another internal conversation late one night. You should have told her sooner. I know. You loved her. I know. Then why did you keep running? Long silence. Then finally, because being loved felt safer in theory than in reality. That answer stays with him. Because it's honest. Ugly maybe. Incomplete maybe. But honest. And for the first time in his life, honesty is starting to matter to him more than emotional control. That's the shift happening now. Not perfection. Not transformation. Just a tired man slowly becoming unable to lie to himself anymore. And somewhere underneath all the hesitation, all the fear, all the shame, there's still one simple truth sitting quietly at the center of him. He wants to hear her voice again. Not because loneliness disappeared into romance. Because despite all the avoidance, despite all the silence, despite all the fear, she still feels emotionally like home to him. In the end, it isn't one dramatic moment. That's the strange truth about emotional collapse. People imagine some huge revelation, a life-changing conversation, a cinematic apology in the rain. But most real emotional breaking points happen quietly, alone, usually after months of pretending everything is manageable. And honestly, that's exactly what happens to him. Not all at once. Slowly, like something inside him finally gets too tired to keep running. Because avoidance takes energy. More energy than people realize. It takes energy to suppress attachment, to intellectualize grief, to miss someone while acting emotionally detached, to constantly regulate vulnerability before it reaches the surface. And eventually, the nervous system starts losing the ability to maintain the performance. That's where he is now, emotionally exhausted, not only from losing her, from losing himself inside the avoidance. There is a specific night where something shifts permanently. Nothing dramatic happened that day. No big trigger. No emotional confrontation. Actually, the day was painfully ordinary. Work, traffic, groceries, the gym, normal life. But sometimes ordinary life becomes unbearable once enough emotional truth has accumulated underneath it. He gets home late, drops his keys onto the kitchen counter, takes off his shoes. The apartment is quiet again, but this time the silence feels different. Not sharp, not panicked, just deeply sad. That's the thing about prolonged emotional suppression. Eventually, the adrenaline wears off, and underneath the avoidance, there's usually grief waiting quietly. Real grief. Not only for the relationship, for all the moments he emotionally disappeared from his own life. He walks into the kitchen absent-mindedly and opens the refrigerator, stares into it without really looking, then closes it again. The movement itself feels automatic. like his body is exhausted from functioning normally while emotionally unraveling internally. So he sits on the edge of the couch in darkness. No TV, no music, and for once, he stops trying to distract himself from the feeling immediately. That's new. Usually he interrupts the emotion quickly. Phone, noise, movement, anything. But tonight he just sits there. And honestly, it hurts. Not poetically, humanly. His chest feels heavy, his throat tight, his breathing shallow. In that subtle way grief changes the body without permission. And then the thoughts start surfacing again. Not dramatic thoughts, simple ones. I really hurt her sometimes. I loved her more than I admitted. I was scared the entire time. I kept asking for distance, then suffered inside the silence I created. That last realization stays in the room with him, because it finally exposes the full contradiction. He spent so much time treating intimacy like danger, without realizing emotional disconnection was slowly destroying him too. That awareness breaks something open quietly. Not ego, not masculinity, the emotional numbness itself. There is an internal dialogue happening again. You can't keep doing this. Doing what? Running from people the second they matter. Silence. Then eventually, I know. And for the first time, he really means it. Not intellectually, not theoretically. His body means it now too. That's what changes everything. When the nervous system becomes exhausted by avoidance itself. Because eventually emotional suppression stops feeling protective and starts feeling lonely in a way that's impossible to romanticize anymore. That's where he is now. No longer proud of the detachment. No longer comforted by distance. Just tired. Tired of emotionally abandoning himself every time love becomes real. There is another realization slowly forming underneath all of this too. One he resisted for a long time. He didn't actually want freedom from love. He wanted freedom from the fear love activated inside him. That distinction matters, because now he can finally see the truth more clearly. She wasn't the emotional threat. The vulnerability was. Being seen, being emotionally dependent, being soft enough for another person to affect him deeply. That's what terrified him. So he kept trying to control the closeness instead of surrendering to it honestly. Pulling away, returning, withdrawing, missing her, repeating the cycle, until eventually the relationship collapsed under the weight of emotional inconsistency. And now, he's left sitting alone inside the full emotional reality of it. No distractions left. No emotional shortcuts left. Just honesty. Messy honesty. The kind that arrives late and doesn't magically fix anything. There's a moment where he stands up and starts pacing slowly through the apartment. His body restless again. He picks up his phone, puts it down, picks it up again, still fighting himself. That part hasn't disappeared. Growth doesn't suddenly remove fear. It just makes the fear harder to hide behind. He opens the message thread again. Her name on the screen immediately changes the emotional atmosphere in the room. Even now, especially now, his thumb hovers over the keyboard. Nothing comes out at first. Because how do you summarize months of emotional confusion honestly? How do you explain that part of you loved deeply while another part kept sabotaging closeness automatically? How do you tell someone, I was overwhelmed by how safe you made me feel? That kind of honesty feels almost unbearable to him. So he sits there in silence again. Then eventually he types one sentence. Just one. I understand things now that I couldn't understand before. He stares at it for a long time. Long enough for doubt to enter again. What if it's too late? What if this only reopens pain? What if he still isn't emotionally ready? What if reaching out is selfish? That last fear matters. Because finally, he's thinking about her emotional experience too. Not only his own loneliness. That changes him more than he realizes. So he doesn't send the message immediately. Maybe he never sends it. Maybe he does later. Honestly, that part almost matters less now. Because the real breaking point already happened internally. The moment he stopped lying to himself. The moment he admitted the avoidance was hurting him too. The moment he realized emotional control had become emotional isolation. That's what finally cracks him open. Not spiritual awakening. Not destiny. Not mystical transformation. Just the unbearable exhaustion of living emotionally disconnected from himself. There's another thought that surfaces quietly while he sits there. Maybe love was never the thing destroying me. Maybe resisting it was. That thought changes the emotional atmosphere completely. Because for the first time, he stops framing vulnerability as weakness. Now it just feels human. Scary. Uncomfortable. Risky. But human. And honestly, that realization makes him emotional in a way he can't fully suppress anymore. Not dramatic sobbing. Just tears showing up suddenly while he stares at the floor trying to hold himself together. That kind of crying. The kind men often do alone, because they still don't fully know how to be witnessed inside emotional softness safely. He wipes his face quickly afterward almost automatically. Old conditioning. Then laughs at himself quietly because nobody else is even there. That moment says everything. Even alone, part of him still instinctively hides his emotions. But another part is finally getting tired of hiding altogether. That's the real shift happening now. Not perfection. Permission. Permission to stop pretending he never cared that deeply. Permission to stop performing emotional independence constantly. Permission to admit he misses her. Permission to admit he was scared. Permission to admit love affected him more than his pride wanted to allow. And strangely, once he stops fighting those truths so aggressively, his body softens a little. Not healed, not fixed, just softer. Like the nervous system finally exhaled after months of emotional resistance. That's what finally breaks him open. Not losing her, not even grief itself. It's the realization that he cannot keep surviving through emotional disconnection forever without losing parts of himself in the process. And maybe that realization comes late. Maybe painfully late. But it's real. And real matters more than perfect now. So he sits there quietly in the dark holding all the unfinished feelings at once. Love, regret, fear, relief, shame, longing. None of it fully resolved. Because real emotional growth rarely arrives as clean closure. Sometimes it arrives as honesty first. Messy honesty. Human honesty. The kind that whispers, I don't want to run from my own heart anymore. And honestly, that may be the first truly open thing he's ever allowed himself to feel. I mean, the title's emotionally triggering, psychologically specific, and aligned with the raw confessional tone of the script.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.